All right, good afternoon, everyone. We're just going to wait about one more minute for any latecomers, and then we'll get started.
I think you were gonna remind you to record it too, right?
Yes, I got it. Thank you.
You're welcome. Sorry.
Oh, no, thank you for the reminder. There's a good chance I would have forgotten, so. Okay, it's 4:01. We're going to get started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jessica, and I'm one of the co-hosts of Colloquium. So welcome to the first Colloquium of the 2020/2021 school year. We hope you have all found a comfortable spot to engage with your colleagues via Zoom, and maybe even grabbed yourself a little treat since we were unable to mail fresh brownies or Rice Krispie treats to each of your remote work locations. Similar to last spring, we will be using Zoom to host Colloquium this year until further notice. I would like to take a moment to thank everyone that signed up to present this year. We have an exciting calendar of presenters to look forward to. Also, thank you to all of you who are fighting off the creeping feelings of Zoom fatigue to be here with us. Lastly, thank you to my co-coordinator, Kelly Rice McNeil and Angie Adams for helping to organize this. With that said, since I'm in the Health and Human Performance Department, I would be amiss if I did not remind you that it is helpful to take some physical activity breaks here and there, maybe some air squats or some dance moves to help you stay engaged and to think of some critical questions for Wilson. All right, anyways, moving on to the reason that you are all here. Today you are in for a treat as we get to hear from Wilson Zare. Wilson is a faculty member in the College of Business here at Eastern Oregon University, and he will be presenting on innovation and market leadership in technology in the technology industry. Wilson, who has his doctorate in technology and management from Walden University, has been teaching at EOU since the fall of 2015. Aside from his doctorate, he also completed graduate work at Portland State University, where he completed his MBA and studied technology management as well as system sciences. Aside from his teaching at EOU, Wilson has also taught courses in marketing, finance, innovation, entrepreneurship, and business strategy for Northeastern University in Boston, Oregon State University in Corvallis, Portland State University in Portland, Concordia University in Portland, and Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok. Prior to teaching, Wilson started his career as a software engineer and then moved into full lifecycle product marketing, program management, strategic alliances, and executive leadership. He even became a CEO before the age of 40. As a successful entrepreneur, he has participated in or started 8 technology startups and consulted on dozens of successful early stage companies. Wilson continues to build on his teaching and research while focusing on market-based innovation, entrepreneurship, strategic marketing, emerging technology, hybrid business models, analytical decision models, and business strategy. I would like to thank you again, Wilson, on behalf of the Colloquium Committee for presenting today. Please take it away.
Thank you, Jessica. Appreciate it. I'm not sure how I'm gonna, top that. Put the bar pretty high. Anyway, good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to start out by the topic we'll talk about today is innovation and market leadership in the technology industry. It's the subject of a research project I've just finished. It's for the last 3 years working on competitive behavior in the technology industry and trying to look at different forms of innovation that lead to market leadership. And especially in the case where it's, we have sustainable or defensible market leadership. So going from there, just start out with a question. So we look at the tech big 5 right now, the companies that are traded on the stock exchange. What do all these companies have in common? imagine. I don't know that I'm even going to be able to see the questions on here, but we'll just make it a hypothetical question at this point. The response is that none of these firms existed before 1975. And honestly, that's the time frame for this study, the study I worked on as well. But in spite of the fact that none of these firms existed before 1975, I'm just going to collapse this window. They have over 1 million employees, almost $1 trillion in revenue, and almost $7 trillion in market cap. Apple was the first company to exceed $1 trillion in market capitalization. Both Microsoft and Alphabet, which is Google, are both in the same position right now. Innovation, it turns out that innovation is responsible for 80% of US economic growth since World War II. That's what Schumpeter, the economist, called creative destruction. The idea of new companies and new technologies creating new opportunities and destroying the old ones. So innovation is critical to what happens in our economy, the growth in our economy, employment, and a lot of other factors that go with that. When we think about innovation, one of the models, the kind of cornerstone models in the discipline is something called Rogers diffusion theory. So according to Rogers' theory, that new technology emerges and then it's adopted by the marketplace over time. It starts with innovators, then early adopters, early majority, late majority, until we end up with 100% market penetration at some point. Truth be told, we never really get to 100% market penetration, or 100% of people adopting anything, but 100% of the potential market for that innovation. Of course, there are no guaranteed. Many products that are launched and many technologies are not successful at all. So Geoffrey Moore introduced this idea of crossing the chasm, the fact that lots of products die between the stage of early adopters to early majority. Early adopters, they can adapt to some little flaws and inconsistencies in the product, where the early majority wants something pretty polished and with a clear value proposition. And not all products, services, technologies can make it. Going one step further, if we take that look at that diffusion, we can see that it gives rise to something we call an S-curve of technology innovation. So as the products are rolled out, we continue to have incremental innovation that will move an offering along an existing S-curve, or if we have some kind of a disruptive innovation, it takes us to another S-curve. Take the example of going from like the flip phone to the smartphone, right? Usually this transition favors the new entrants at the expense of the incumbents. And the way that comes about is usually when you shift to a new S-curve, you've got a cluster of different competing offerings, technological offerings or product offerings. And then they usually converge on a dominant design. And as they converge on a dominant design, we'll see incremental innovation as they move along the new S-curve. Taking this one step further gives rise to the Abernathy-Utterback model, the AU model. And this describes how the focus of innovation over that life cycle. What they found, Abernathy and Utterback found, was that firms tend to focus on product innovation early in the life cycle, when that allowed them to get a competitive advantage. But as a dominant design is established and the market gets more mature, firms tend to focus on process innovation because it lets them, take advantage of economies of scale, make manufacturing more efficiently, and increase profits. So this is a model that's been around for a very long time, and it's still relevant. The only thing that's changed is our view of innovation. These days, when we think about innovation, we're not just talking about product and process innovation. When Rogers and Abernathy and Utterback talk about innovation, they're really talking about technological product or process innovation. However, these days we also talk about marketing innovation, organizational innovation, business model innovation is very popular, and there are a number of other frameworks as well. And none of these are reflected in this primary model of innovation. So the general problem we started out to address was that, first of all, there doesn't really seem to be a consensus on the forms of innovation it can take. Secondly, foundational models like the AU model only cover product and process innovation. They don't really, embrace all the types of innovation that are kind of widely accepted today. And the reason why that's important is because if we look at these other forms of innovation, the research tells us that they can produce even larger returns in product and process innovation, and they're far more sustainable over time. So how do we go about doing that? How do we go about exploring that? What we chose to do was put together an expert panel, and it gave rise to this research question. What is the consensus of an expert panel of innovators and researchers on the forms of innovation that were used by competitors to establish market leadership over the historical life cycle of the technology industry? Now, that is a mouthful. The basic idea is that we're looking at we want to find an industry where we can get a view of the entire life cycle and the data still available, so we can use an expert panel to evaluate it. The research method that we came up with was to use a qualitative E-Delphi process using an analytical hierarchical process model, decision model. AHP, by the way, is quantitative, not qualitative. So we're mixing the two methods. And we're basing it on 45 years of historical industry results from 1975 to 2020. You remember from the first slide, Microsoft and Apple were first formed in 1975 and 1976. So we're going to build consensus on market share leaders, the forms of innovation considered, and then look at each market share leader and see what form of innovation they use. In terms of the panel itself, we found that in the literature that most Delphi panels had between 15 and 20 participants. We wanted to have 20 plus, going to be at the upper edge of that. We also know that participation tends to fall off over time. So we needed to start with something in excess of that. We were looking for experts in the technology industry, people with a keen understanding of the PC industry and how it evolved. And we wrestled with the idea of how do we find those people? How do we find a wide audience of experts like this? And we decided to use LinkedIn, social media for business professionals. This was kind of an interesting approach because there's not a whole lot of literature out there on using social media in this kind of expert panel research right now. So that was one of the things that made this study kind of distinctive. In terms of the process we used to find our experts, we first started out with, we started out using My LinkedIn and Network. At that point, it was about, slightly over 2,600 connections. I think we're over 2,700 now. But anyway, we started out with a LinkedIn post with a message describing the research project and asking people if they would be willing to participate. The people who came back and said that they were willing to participate, we sent them a link to actually access the study. That got us about halfway there. In order to build out the rest of the panel, we actually did the opposite process. We went through and screened the LinkedIn entries based on the level of experience to find those people that were eligible, and then sent them an email message in LinkedIn inviting them to the survey. And we selected the first 18 that came back and responded to that. So that gave us a panel of about 30 experts. This is a process I think that you'll see used more often in research. This LinkedIn has a reach of over 600 million users in 200 countries. About 50% of college-educated Americans have a profile on LinkedIn. So it's a pretty powerful tool for this kind of work. The second step is we had to really build a data set for our experts to evaluate. I wasn't able to locate 45 years of market share data anywhere for the PC industry. There were bits and pieces of it. The early part of the industry was very difficult to find. So we actually needed to build it from a number of different data sets. So we pulled this information together, then it was cross-validated, filled, smooth, make sure there were no gaps. So we have 45 years, at least the top market share leaders were over the 45 years in the PC industry. So this is pretty unique too. I haven't seen a data set like this one, so we'll probably use it for other kinds of research as well. Moving on from there, we actually did 2 rounds in our research study. The first one was we looked at, I skipped over the slide, sorry. So we start with 30, there was 2 rounds. So the first phase, we looked at the forms of innovation. We wanted everybody to agree on the forms of innovation that would be used to evaluate the market share leaders. In phase 2, we actually evaluated each of the market share leaders to associate them with a form of innovation. And then we calculated the consensus. We started with 30. By question 2, we were at 27. In phase 2, we had 24 come into that, and then finished up with about 19 by the end of the second round. So going back once again to the selection criteria, we wanted to have between 15 and 20. So we're well within the range of credible eDelphi studies. In terms of the forms of innovation, our experts agreed that both product and process were well established in the industry. Marketing and organizational should also be considered. Organizational in this case included business model innovation, but we'll talk more about that later. We also added a write-in where our experts could add additional forms of innovation, and we didn't have any additional write-ins. So this was pretty spot on from the standpoint of our experts at this point in time. Then we went through and we looked at the responses for each of the market share leaders. You can see them along the top: Altair, ASP, Apple, IBM, Commodore. So that in our study, we went through each and asked them to rate each one based on product, process, marketing, or organizational innovation. One of the things about using an AHP decision model is that AHP typically uses something called a pairwise comparison, where I'm comparing one element to the next. So if I was doing pairwise for this comparison, I would compare product to process, then product to marketing, then product to organizational, and people would rank the relative importance of each. It's typically done on a Satté scale. Satté is the person who originally invented AHPs, longtime professor at Wharton, and used to work for the National Science Foundation. Typically using a Satté scale, the problem in this case, with doing it that way is that because of the mathematics, so we're not allowed to have a 0. And there may be cases where, for example, organizational innovation played no role. So we need to be able to have a 0 value, and the AHP doesn't really support that. In addition, even if somebody ranked them both evenly, we wouldn't know, there's a question of magnitude. So you wouldn't know if they're equally unimportant, equally very important, somewhere else. So what we did instead is we used a Likert scale on the front end using 1 to 9. Often Likert scales are in the 1 to 5-ish range, but the literature seems to support using 1 to 9. And then having our expert panel evaluate based on that scale, and then using a transformation by subtracting one from the other to actually get to create a pairwise comparison output. And we also asked our expert panel for their confidence level in these estimates. So anyway, once we had this information, this is the mathematical part. We had to create a mathematical consensus using AHP. The way we did that, once again, is using the transformation. We built out a priority matrix, a normalized matrix, and then the priority vector. And the priority vector that you see, capital W1 through capital W4 is what we would use to actually evaluate the importance of these items. There is something called a consistency index in AHP, which we calculated that probably wasn't needed in this case, consistent because we're not really we didn't use a traditional form of pairwise comparison. Here's an example of the type of output we ended up with Apple. So you can see the geometric mean of the responses, and then the transformations, and then finally the priority vectors. So we did this for 4 forms of innovation for 11 market leaders of 45 years of data. And this is what we came out with, these summary results. The pairwise analysis on the bottom really gives us the spread. And the thing that's interesting that makes the pairwise especially interesting is that when we're using a Likert scale, that's really an ordinal scale. But when we do the AHP conversion, it takes the numbers to a ratio scale, which means I can actually compare them. So if I have a product innovation that's 0.1, a process that's 0.2, it says a process is actually twice as important as product. And that wouldn't really be possible to do with an ordinal scale. If we take this one step further and we look at diffusion, apply these numbers to the PC market diffusion, we'd find from these Census Bureau numbers at first that it does approximate a normal distribution. A normal distribution would have it, full market penetration about 2025. We're at 90%, just under 90% in 2016, which leaves us pretty close. You can see the other numbers along the center of the slide in terms of the number of years it took to reach each point. We then took those results and we plotted them over time to get a more visual, a visual representation of what it looked like. And what we found is that, consistent with the AU model, product innovation trends down over time, process tends up and then falls. Marketing innovation trends up, and organizational innovation trends up at the very end. So those results, the first two are consistent with the existing AU model. The second two are new because, of course, they weren't included in the original AU model. They weren't looking for those types of innovation. However, the one thing that's curious about this is that in the center, we see this kind of oscillating pattern where it goes back and forth between organizational and marketing and product innovation. So we're curious about this. And we also noticed that, if we look at the leaders and we looked at that confidence interval that was on the survey, the confidence interval is lowest right there where that oscillating pattern is. So looking at these numbers or the names of these market share leaders, we can see that the two right in that space are Commodore and Apple. And we actually got some comments about Commodore because experts were like, they were familiar with the name Commodore, but not as a major player in the PC market. If we dig into this a little bit and try to separate these, what we can see is that, Commodore and Apple have more often been consumer devices rather than business devices. And of course, at the very beginning of the industry, Altair, Tandy, Apple, these were hobbyists, as the industry was getting started. Whereas IBM, Packard Bell, Compaq, Dell, HP, they're mostly business computing devices. If we look at IBM, somebody like IBM, the way that they first became popular was by switching to the business market. They had channels in place with the business marketplace from their, their mainframe business. So when they rolled out the PC, literally within 2 years, IBM had 40% or more market share. Sold millions of computers almost immediately. Not really based on the technology, because lots of that technology exists. They use the Intel processor, they use software from Microsoft, they use the traditional von Neumann architecture. But the fact that they offered it to a new audience that saw value was hugely beneficial to them. Whereas Commodore was not really in that marketplace. But when you look at somebody like Commodore in the home computing market, this was, pre-internet. The first internet browser was not even available until 1995. So the innovation you saw with Commodore was more around game titles. They were offering more software titles, more things for people to do with their device, which was a technological product innovation. So that's why you see that spike back up. But if you look at business computing, much more focused in that time frame on process innovation. So Packard Bell was a Israeli company that was just selling really cheap computers, and Compaq took advantage of selling a standard architecture after IBM tried to make a technological break. So for example, in this case, IBM, by trying to introduce new technology, their microchannel architecture, they actually allowed Compaq to take over a leadership position by focusing on business enterprises. So, and anyway, if we look at that business market and break it down farther and look at the adoption rates, what we find is that the adoption rates were very high. In some segments like professional and technical managers, administrators, within just a couple of years, we got to 50% market penetration. In other segments, like laborers and service and operatives, we're still not at 50% after 45 years, and maybe never will be. So what we'd have to do to conclude is, at least in the business segment, that this assumption of a normal distribution does not really hold true. So Rogers' model, at least within this segment, we would need to explore further. And I'm guessing if we explored other segments, we would find the same. The first one looked at really household penetration, which did follow normal distribution, but we find that that there's a difference based on segment. In terms of research findings overall, in terms of research findings overall, we found that product, process, marketing, and organizational innovation were the right ones to use, at least in this market segment, based on our expert opinion. The HP decision model that we were using shows promise in that it reduced the number of eDelphi rounds. We were able to get to consensus very quickly with a mathematical consensus that was ratio scale. The Likert to pairwise allowed us to make fewer selections, so n versus n times n minus 1, which could be very valuable as the number of comparisons gets very large. We didn't have to worry about consistency at all, because the Likert judgments that people did up front were completely consistent. And we didn't have to worry about zero values. It just wasn't an issue. We found that the diffusion was not normal in subsegments, and that product and process innovation early in the cycle held true, but marketing and organizational innovation were very important from the mid stage to the later stages of the life cycle. And in fact, marketing innovation took hold much sooner than we would have expected. So if we look at the traditional AU model, here we have product innovation, and once again, in this case, in the original AU model, that was analogous with technological product innovation, although certainly there are lots of products that do not have a technology basis. But we found that with product innovation, there's diminishing marginal value. As you add each new little feature, um, the users may be less and less willing to, you know, to pay the same value for it. So for example, if you think about the smartphone market, you know, the replacement cycle now keeps growing, you know, from 2 years to 3 years to 4 years, because there's not enough value in the incremental features that are being added for people to justify wholesale replacement. Then when we talk about process innovation, there's some diminishing marginal effectiveness that takes place there as well. I mean, you could take advantage of early economies of scale, but at some point, you've squeezed all the waste out of the system, and so there's no real savings there to pass along in terms of either lower price or higher margin. Then, in the extended AU model, we can add marketing innovation, and we can add organizational innovation. So this is a new model that innovators or decision makers can use when they're mapping out how to pursue leadership within an industry. In terms of recommendations, the original AU model was based on a large data set of a number of different industries. In our case, we had a single industry, but more years of observations. So there is the opportunity to expand the number of firms that we're looking at to try and validate the data across industries. Secondly, we didn't look at all at what forms of innovation did not lead to market leadership. So it would have been interesting to see what forms of innovation those pursued who were not successful in the end. And then we should explore Rogers' model to figure out where that assumption of a normal distribution holds and where it doesn't hold. By the way, Rogers' diffusion theory, I mean, they've sold, I think it's on the 5th edition of that book, and they've sold 30,000 copies of each one. So this is widely disseminated. So that would be something important to explore. We need to standardize the definition of business model innovation. Business model innovation has been an extremely hot topic, especially since the dot-com bubble. But the problem is that nobody really knows what a business model is. I mean, people think they know what it is, but if you try to find a standardized definition in the literature, it's very difficult to do. And if you can't even define what a business model is, it becomes very difficult to define what business model innovation is, even though there's a lot of literature right now on business model innovation. So it would be really helpful to define that, to better define it, and figure out exactly how it fits into organizational innovation. The social media network, being able to use social media network to build out an expert panel was a really effective tool in this case. And it was not only effective to increase our reach, but it was also effective to be able to validate our participants, right? It wasn't just somebody telling us they were an expert. We were able to look at their profile and see that they were experts. But there doesn't really seem to be any tools to be able to look at the demographics and the spread. And it would be really interesting to have a tool that would tell us how diverse our network was and our panel was, and being able to select people around those demographics. So there's probably a market opportunity there somewhere. And then we could expand the testing of the Likert to pairwise technique. I think it has a lot of potential. Of course, the purists will be slow to adopt it, but I do think it has a lot of applications, and it solves some limitations of AHP. And AHP, by the way, just to give you some idea of how popular that is, Satte's original publication, How to Make a Decision, I think if I look at the citations, in Google Scholar or somewhere else, he's up above 60,000 citations now. So that's a method that's extremely popular in literature. So that's what I have as a foundation. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. See if I can find the question thing.
Wilson, I got a question. This
All
is,
right.
hey, yeah, I guess in my experience, it was fairly common, you know, in my career for people to talk about innovation, just like you said, in terms of product and process.
Mhm.
And then marketing and organizational, you know, they didn't talk about it in terms of innovation. It's just something they evaluated, right? It's probably back to your business model question where maybe it really wasn't part of their terminology, or they hadn't been trained to think innovation that way. Did you find that? Have you found that with these experts, that you had to describe what those were?
Yeah, we did describe this. One of the pieces of advice I got as a grad student that I decided to ignore, much to my peril, was not to research innovation, because the field is just so big. I mean, there's literally thousands of articles published on the topic. And one of the organizations that I found was the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. It's an international organization. You know, it's got I don't know, over 100 member countries. And one of the topics they work on is innovation, try to define a definition. And they've done a number of different versions over time. But in addition to that, there are a lot of different other models that people try to embrace as well. So we tended to go with the OECD model, and then explained it to the experts, and then look for the experts to push back, to say, oh no, that's not the way I see it. That doesn't feel right to me. But we didn't really get any pushback at all. They said, yeah, no, that feels good. Let's go with that. But we did have to describe it. And you're right. I mean, depending on where you're at, you know, the way people think about innovation is really different. And in fact, you know, innovation is kind of funny too, because when you look at the literature, you find that innovation can be new to the world, new to the industry, new to the business. I mean, what justifies innovation? Innovation, you know, by definition, is something that's new. And in order to have innovation, you need to have commercialization by definition. But you know, that it's a little squishy in that way.
Yeah, and that leads to one of my other questions. You know, I understand, like you said, the process innovation tails off. The impact of that tails off eventually when you squeezed everything out of it in terms of waste. But occasionally then there's something that happens that's innovated, that can be put into a line, for instance, that, you know, makes a step jump in that process again. So you got innovation building on innovation to help impact results.
Oh yeah, no, exactly. I mean, you thinking about that, I mean, you could have your own, you know, life cycle adoption curve for a specific manufacturing technology.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah, definitely. You know, if you think about, you know, like the semiconductor industry now, they get bigger wafers, smaller lines, more density, but you know, they approach the limits of what you can do on silicon, you know, at some point. I think Jessica, there might be a chat box here, but I'm not seeing a way to look at it. Let's see.
There is a chat box. We have a comment from earlier from one of your first slides about what the companies have in common. But if you're listening, you can type your question into the chat box, or you can unmute yourself and ask as well. Do you see the chat box at the bottom of the screen, Wilson?
I don't. Yeah, my screen doesn't really have that. You know, remote control, annotate.
Well, if nobody else has questions, I don't want to dominate the questions, I guess. I didn't hear you. I missed it if you said it. I mean, there was a slide where you talked about question fatigue versus round fatigue.
Uh-huh.
What, was there any determination there?
In our case, it was most likely question fatigue because we didn't have a lot of roads. We used
Right.
this mathematical decision model, which means that we were able to converge on its decision pretty rapidly. And of course, the experts were able to validate that, right? We created a mathematical consensus. We showed it to the experts. They said, yeah, no, that's good, right? But I think overall, it only required 2 rounds. And with Delphi, 3 to 5 rounds is not uncommon. And that's usually where you run into round fatigue. But you could see, if we looked earlier here, let's see if we can get this. I need to get out of presenter mode so I can go backwards more effectively. I don't know if it's going to let me do that at this point. Well, yeah, you can see over here that you can see the drop off based on the number of questions. So I think we lost 3 going from round 1 to round 2, or phase 1 to phase 2. There was another step in the middle where we allowed people to look at the summarized results and agree or not agree. But we lost 5 of them based on just the walking through those additional questions. It's a lot of, if you think about 4 or 5 selections, we go here, you're answering these 5 questions for 11 different companies. That's 55 different questions. And if people have to think about, oh, what is product innovation? Who was that company? What did they do? You're asking people to do a lot. It doesn't seem like it, but it is,
Hi, Wilson.
Hey, how are you, Nancy?
Good. How are you?
Good.
I'm not sure I'm following all of the inquiry process that you went through, but I'm curious about the interface between the sort of historical moment that these organizations were in operation and the results. Do you see, because the timeline kept featuring behind things and underneath things. Do you see the historical moment as being a factor in some of this stuff?
Well, I'm sure that the answer is yes. The environment always plays a role. And at some point, when you have, even if you think about that life cycle model, somebody who's an early adopter, they're probably looking for different things than somebody who's a late majority kind of user. Late majority kind of user, they just want to plug it in and go. They're not interested if it's, it's got all the latest, probably not as interested. And if it has all the latest bells and whistles. So it definitely has a role. I think, if you look at somebody like Dell, their real innovation was in channels, right? Michael Dell started out selling computers in his dorm room, mail order. And so there was, there's some element of being able to, build to demand, not have the inventory, being able to have a one-to-one connection with the consumer. Of course, as Dell grew and the internet became a factor, they were early to adopt that, to embrace it, that direct-to-consumer model. But if you were to start today, would that direct-to-consumer model be enough? I think not. You would need some different kind of innovation to be different or better. So yeah, no, it definitely, if you need to leapfrog somebody, you're going to have to be different. That's the innovation part, but different in a way that's very important to your customer.
I keep thinking about the fact that we're in a sort of perpetual crisis right now, and the role of crisis in kickstarting innovation or dead-ending concepts that can't function in this new crisis environment.
Yeah, that's true too. And if we look at, in particular, if you look at, this movement from one S curve to another, I mean, crisis can prompt that kind of thing too. I mean, there's, we had the example of the flip phone to the iPhone. It's a perfect example. But think about people's movement to Zoom right now. I mean, if somebody told me a year ago I'd be doing my classes on Zoom and having most of my meetings on Zoom, I would have thought, that was fantasy. But here we are, and will it go back to normal? Well, maybe, but I think people's perception of what normal is will be changed forever, probably.
Thank you.
Sure. Anything else? What do you think, Nathan? I see him smiling face out there. I know he's always got something to.
Nathan would be all over this.
Yeah. I was working on, I'm sorry, I was kind of multitasking, but yeah, I was listening and peeking up here and there.
He's gonna whip his mathematics on you there, Wilson.
I think.
Yeah, I saw you were breaking out the matrices and everything.
Yeah, I don't think it would take a lot to whip me at mathematics. But I got these ones down.
Yeah. Well, now I was just coming back and I heard you mention Zoom. Did you cover why you thought Zoom grabbed the brass ring with all this? Skype and Google and everything else was existing, and that's pretty much what was on my radar. And then Zoom just grabbed everything.
Oh, well, you know what? This is, I actually have a slide on this too. Not in this deck. I wonder if I have it here. Anyway, that market, the teleconferencing market is strange in that way. Let me see, let's see if maybe I could pull it up. I may have to follow up with it, but so let me see if I can do it verbally for you. So rather than wait for you to find a slide, and I will take the slide. I'll throw it in the backup here after we talk. But if you think about that, think about the conferencing industry, right? In the conferencing industry, it used to be that they had that, the box that like we have in the conference room in Inlo, in the middle of the table. What's that thing called? Oh, I can't remember. It's got a name. At any rate, so that was conferencing. People would just call it, and it would be the speakerphone, and there was additional software went with it. But then we had, we had stuff like WebEx, which dominated for a while. It was originally purchased by Cisco. Actually, the guy who started Zoom worked at WebEx. He was acquired when Cisco acquired WebEx. He went to work there. And then after that, we had GoToMeeting, we had Skype, we had so there's been a number of market leaders in that industry. For Zoom, I mean, their claim to fame was high def video and high def audio, and just being easy to use. And it's very performant too, as you can see. I mean, everything, all the movements, very natural. If in order to do full motion video, you need 30 frames per second, and you need to have not a lot of, you can't drop a lot of packets. And they seem to have mastered that better than anybody else. So I would say, Zoom feels, more like a technological innovation, but it's a shift, and a lot of people are trying to follow along. Like, for example, if you look at Microsoft Teams, now they're trying to retrofit that with video and stuff, so it could fit into this space. Yeah, and I think it's a great question. But the video conferencing or the conferencing industry is one that's got a very long history. It's probably 30 plus years too. Maybe that's next, Nathan. Maybe we'll have to do the same kind of analysis.
And it might be that I haven't been paying as much attention, because I've been used to using, the Google Meetup and whatnot. And I wonder if the fact that Zoom was not locked into an ecosystem helped. Because you can just send somebody a link and you're good to go. I don't know.
The challenge with most Google tools is twofold. One is Google's good at the technology side, but they're not really good on the,
On the usability.
and productizing things, right? I mean, everything feels like a grad student worked on it. And since they give it away for free, nobody really holds their feet to the fire. The second thing is that everything that they create, or most things that I see, is all web oriented. And the challenge is, I know this from software engineering. And in software engineering, we could say, oh, grab the next new programming language and start working on a problem. But that's usually not the right way to solve it. Usually the right way to solve it is to start out with the problem itself first and say, what would it take to fix this problem? And then once you understand how to fix the problem, then you say, what tools can I use to do that, right? And so if you look at, for example, Google has Google Drive, but the guys at Dropbox built a whole company, launched it, IPO'd, extremely successful, solving exactly the same problem. But they started out with the problem and what would it take to solve it, rather than saying, how could I use the web to solve this problem? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I remember early days of Google Drive. There was something really innovative on how they handled files, but it probably wasn't intuitive to a lot of people, and kind of feeding into, like these days Google Drive has folders and it's kind of familiar to what people are using. In the old days, it was more like email tags, like where you would, and you could, and it was innovative because you could have the same file associated with multiple tags, and then they had to kind of slowly over time turn it into folders and something that was familiar to people. And these days it just looks like a file system. But yeah, like it wasn't that was starting with like somebody's cool idea, and as opposed to the problem, like you're saying.
Right. So if you think about, and this is not the only example, and I don't mean to pick on Google. I mean, they're not the only ones with this issue, but it's, if you think about Dropbox, it looks like your file system on your PC, right? So it's all of a sudden, there's no learning curve. You just all of a sudden, you're clicking on stuff, it's going in folders, it's synchronizing across PCs. It's doing exactly what you would expect it to do native in this environment. Do they use the internet? Yes, they do. But they use the internet for communication in the way it should be used. In this case, they do have a web-based interface too that you can open up. But 90% of people are using the native desktop application. Will Google eventually get there? Of course, and so will Microsoft. But the way
this had to do with, well, some of it has to do with gaining enough market share that's like you were saying, Dropbox already worked like something people were familiar with. So I'm thinking going back to Zoom and the ease of use and enough people using it. Were you seeing kind of like an exponential increase in market share with some things once they got enough critical mass?
Oh yeah, that's what, that's what Roger's model is showing you. It's
Yeah.
showing us is that.
Sorry if I'm being redundant with something you already
No,
shared on
okay.
that.
But if you look at this model, you can see how the curve gets. And in fact, this adoption curve, you see this S curve, this is just the velocity, the rate of change on this curve, right? And so here, in this part of the curve, we've got very rapid change. And as we reach the apex here, the speed of change slows down. Yeah, I can tell you, somebody who used those old conferencing tools. I mean, I started out when WebEx was brand new and it was hot. I used that one. I used GoToMeeting. I used, a bunch of these tools along the way. And just the way that Zoom works, you just plugged it and it just worked. And it had high def. The image was better. The sound was better. There was no popping or cracking. They were able to, I don't know, this is probably more than technical information that you want. But in order to do what we're doing here, it takes real-time video, and that's coming across in little packets, frames. In order to, if a frame, I say real-time, meaning when I want to display it, if it's not there, that moment in time is gone. I can't do anything with that frame. And if that frame is missing, what you get is popping or stuttering, right? You've seen that probably. So what we typically do, the way to fix that is you create a jitter buffer where you store packets. So you have a backup. But it seems like Zoom doesn't really need that much. I mean, the latency is a term we use in telecom. The latency is very low on this, and the quality is very high. And the other guys weren't able to master that. The Google one, what it's called, FaceTime? No, that's somebody else.
I think it's Google Meet or something like that.
Yeah, Google Meet. So if you look at that tool, I mean, it's good, it's functional and it's free. But if you think about the number of features and tools, we couldn't have an organized discussion like this using that tool. I mean, it's just not that rich. It's like somebody stopped and they never productized it. I used to run into that a lot working with the guys over at Intel too. It's super smart, and they have new ideas. They create new technology, but they were never good from a software standpoint at productizing things, of making it so that it's packaged and seamless, and people can use it without, uncovering any of the flaws. So in the software industry, we have to take the core technology and we have to take another step further. But Google, since they don't charge people for anything, or mostly they do, then they don't have the same kind of pressure that maybe a Microsoft would.
Thank you. We only have a couple more minutes left. Is there any last minute questions?
Just warn everybody out.
It was very interesting, Wilson. We actually use this in public health, so it was neat to see it in a marketing perspective.
Oh, cool. How do you use it in public health?
Just kind of when people jump onto a different health trend, maybe people getting flu shots or vaccines, or when there's a new health program out or something like that.
Cool. Yeah, no, I can see how that would fit. That makes sense.
Yeah.
So I want to say before we go, I do want to say, add one thing if I can. I wanted to offer a special thanks to Holly and Robert and John Thurber. They all contributed to this research. Holly helped with the surveys. Robert helped me look at different HP models. John helped with the mathematics. And Peter and Gary were, motivational. So we couldn't have done this without a lot of help from a lot of people. And I just wanted to make sure that we thanked them for their effort.
Thank you, Wilson, for a great presentation, and thank you for starting us off for colloquium.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. I really appreciate it. And thanks for being here, everyone.
Our next colloquium will be December 10th. So hope to see you then.
All
Yeah, I
right.
was excited to see that we had one coming, and it's like, oh, yay, Wilson.